Well, hello there, ladies and gentlemen. Today, I will be narrating Chapter 2 of my novel, A Fatal Time to a Final End. You may notice a slight difference in the video quality in this situation. That is because I am using my cell phone now, just to switch it up a little bit and see if I like it any better. I apologize if you don't, but we'll see. Alright, let's begin. Chapter 2, Spontaneity. Ellison entered the coffee shop he'd set the meeting with Pierce at, and found him sitting and waiting for him in the furthermost corner of the place. There were 2 cups of coffee steaming up into the dim atmosphere, one in front of the empty seat across from Pierce, and the other in Pierce's hand. "Hello, Mr. Primsler. I don't mean to be frank, but why exactly are we here?" Ellison took a moment to answer, his mind dancing around the question, a stream of doubts circling the course of action he was about to take. "Well," he started to say before being interrupted by Pierce, who seemed rather impatient. "Did you talk to Stanley about the interview?" "Yes," Ellison replied succinctly. Pierce leaned forward, his facial expression urging him to continue. "He's not interested." Ellison's voice trailed off as he sat down in the booth and grabbed the white mug of black liquid, putting it to his lips and maintaining eye contact with Pierce. A hint of anger crossed Pierce's face and he sighed. "Look, Stanley hasn't done anything in the past 2 years, and he's kept promising that he was going to write another bestseller. He sends in short synopses that seem decent enough, but he never follows through with any of them." Ellison rubbed the back of his neck with subtle nervousness, and he loosened his tie. "Simon, Stanley wrote 4 works, outstandingly received, before he turned 25. Perhaps he's running out of ideas." "Maybe so, but if he wants to keep his career from sliding to a halt, he has to reveal to the world that he hasn't fallen off the face of the earth. I mean, have you heard some of the garbage people are publishing about him anymore?" Primsler nodded, sipping more coffee. "Indeed, but you have to understand where Stanley's coming from." "Oh, where's that?" "He has a very," Ellison paused, almost in reverence, "troubled past that he cannot seem to overcome." "Okay. Well, remember several years ago when he was on talk shows and everything else? Christ, he dated one of the most beautiful actresses in Hollywood, and then everything just kind of fell through. What happened?" Ellison sighed again, pinching the bridge of his nose and then looking coldly across the table at Pierce. His lack of understanding was almost disrespectful. "When Gwendolyn died, way before you were his agent, it psychologically damaged him to the point where he turned to alcohol. And yes, then came Allison Lovelace, the movie star, who got Stanley to open up his heart again, his stony, cynical little heart. And once he did, I swear that I saw the old Stanley, the one open to opportunity, open to living again." Ellison was quiet for a moment, an appearance of sadness washing across his slim, bespectacled face. But she turned out to be very duplicitous, putting Stanley into precarious situation after precarious situation, and he tried very hard to believe that her intentions were pure and to hold their relationship together. However, in the end, she scorned him, and I believe that that obliterated whatever infinitesimal bit of humanity he had left. As the last word left Ellison's mouth, the front entrance of the coffee shop burst open. From behind it Stanley emerged, stumbling in and glancing around with a pair of mirrored clubmaster sunglasses covering his eyes. When he saw Pierce and Ellison sitting together, he strolled over, shifting around and trying not to topple over. Practically falling into the booth beside Primsler, he righted himself in the seat, clasped his hands on the table, and peered over at Pierce, sliding the sunglasses down the bridge of his nose. Awestruck by the swelled shut eye and the cut above his brow, Pierce was speechless. Well, what ravishing things are you two gentlemen discussing this morning? Stanley asked, glancing back and forth between their surprised faces, and then answering for them with, "Me? I should have expected." Stanley let out a deep breath and glanced over his shoulder and up at the ceiling, looking for smoke detectors. Although there was a sign with the words "No Smoking" in heavy black lettering hanging against the wall behind the counter, Stanley took a shiny black pipe out from his inner coat pocket and began packing it with aromatic vanilla tobacco. He then put it into his mouth, lit it, and started puffing clouds of silky white smoke. In between his smoky exhales, he glared at Pierce and leaned forward on the table. "Now, Simon, what possessed you to believe that parading an emotionally unstable pariah was a good idea?" When Pierce failed to reply with nothing but "uhs" coming out from behind his thin lips, Stanley raised his eyebrows, the eye that wasn't swelled shut getting large and inquiring. Finally, after several tense, awkward seconds, Pierce said curtly, "Stanley, quite honestly, I don't give a shit about your issues or whatever the hell you decide to do in your free time. It is very clear that you're getting washed up, and I'm trying to postpone that the best I can. But if you don't want my help, then fine. Don't go to the interview. The publisher that you're signed with will drop you just as quickly as they picked you up." Stanley pretended to consider this in a mocking fashion and sat against the cushiony booth. "You know what? If it's that important to you and the precious publisher, I'll go, but I won't promise you a smooth, propitious happening." Pierce, pleasantly surprised, smiled. "By the way, what exactly did happen to your face there?" Stanley laughed at him. "I thought you didn't care about what I do in my free time," he replied, mocking Pierce's voice. Ellison intervened before a quarrel could break out. He was involved in a little bar scuffle. Pierce sighed and shook his head, standing up and pressing the wrinkles from his pants. "Just try not to get arrested in the meantime, all right?" "Not to worry, Simon. I'm in good standing with the police around here. But getting back to business, I am going to need the information for this little interview. Ellison has it already. Since he seems to be your caretaker anymore, I'm sure he'll have no trouble getting you there." With that, Pierce made his exit. "What a guy, eh, Primsler?" Stanley said, playfully elbowing Ellison in the ribs. "What exactly changed your mind on the situation?" Ellison asked. "The fact that it's 9 a.m. and I'm drunk already could be a contributing factor," Stanley said, trailing off, his gaze shifting around and his vision getting foggy. "How are you awake at this hour, anyway?" Ellison asked with incredulous intrigue. The question drifted into Stanley's ear and went out the other. "Did you hear me?" Ellison asked. Ellison's questioning broke through Stanley's haze, and he snapped back to reality for a moment. "What?" "I asked, how are you awake already?" Stanley thought for several moments, while at the same time trying to focus on the no smoking sign, as if to get his eyes to stop drifting around aimlessly. "I had another nightmare. Most of my nights are plagued with them anymore. Can barely get a wink." Stanley shifted in his seat, and a twinge of pain twisted his face. Besides, I'm rather sore from last night's scuffle," he said, sighing. "May I ask what your nightmares contained?" Ellison asked into the coffee mug as he put it to his lips and took a sip. "Need you even inquire?" Ellison's subtle look of distress only intensified with furrowed brow. He shook his head. "Stanley, will you ever move on?" Stanley laughed at the question for a moment and randomly shifted his attention over to one of the servers. He waved his hand up in the air to get her attention. "Excuse me, miss. May I get a cup of coffee? I'm ever so parched." Ellison sunk back into the seat, embarrassed by Stanley's disregard for the rules of the establishment and for his alcoholic condition. The girl he flagged down marched over to their table with an air of disgust. "Sir, you are not allowed to smoke in here," she said, pointing over to the sign and coughing for effect. Stanley removed his pipe from his mouth and blew a stream of smoke in Ellison's direction, then looked up at the girl. She was attractive, in her mid-20s, with short blonde hair and a thin face. Stanley looked over at the sign with a dubious expression adorning his face and set his pipe gently on the table, resting it against the napkin dispenser. My dear, I am not merely smoking. It's more or less of a carcinogenic air freshener. Secondly, I suppose I shall respect your policies. Now, may I get that cup of joe, please? She glared down at him for a few moments, trying to think of where she'd seen him before. Her mind not coming up with an answer, she decided to ask, with a hint of irritation still in her voice. Who are you? You look familiar to me. A great big narcissistic smile split Stanley's lips apart. By chance, have you ever read the novel Ravensbrook Memoirs? She thought for a moment. Yeah, I think so. Was it a romance? More or less. An epiphany struck her. Oh, yeah, I read it a couple years ago. It was great. Ellison face-palmed and looked up at the waitress. Lady, go easy. You're feeding a wildfire called ego right here. She didn't quite catch on for a moment or two, and suddenly it hit her that she was standing in front of the man who had authored it. Oh my God, you're S. Kane Cromwell. Realizing that she screamed, she toned her voice down a little, blushing. Wow, I don't know what to say. Well, most people tend to throw things at me to autograph. Usually they don't say anything at all. To dismiss the possibility of her thinking that he was an overly egotistical person, he threw in a little chuckle at the end of the sentence. She met his laughter, hers tinged with nervousness. Wait a minute, I have your latest book in the back. Will you wait here while I go get it? A look of disappointment smoothed over Stanley's features. Really, that's not one of my favorites. Never saw myself as much of a poet, actually. What are you talking about? Your poetry's amazing, she exclaimed, sounding almost offended. You're such a romantic guy writing all of it. You must have a wonderful girl to base it all from, right? Ellison swallowed hard and sipped at his coffee awkwardly as Stanley sat there, looking at her, the color in his face draining. No, he uttered, taking a very long pause, the vivacity of his voice completely gone. I used to have a muse, but not anymore. Oh, well, if you don't mind me asking, whatever did happen between you and that Lovelace girl? You seemed like such a cute couple when I'd see you in the magazines. Cripes, she might as well stab him in the heart at this point, Ellison thought to himself throughout the discourse. He fiddled with the spoon and stirred his coffee around a bit, wondering how Stanley was going to handle himself. He was hoping that a scene wasn't about to be made. Well, darling, Stanley began, Miss Lovelace was not exactly the epitome of a morally just young woman. We dated for 2 years, and I suppose she grew tired of me because one evening, ironically the one where I'd staged a 2-year anniversary party, she neglected to arrive. So I went to the hotel she was staying at, and when I knocked on the door, the man she had been cheating on me with answered. As you might imagine, this contravention of my trust and love pretty much eroded me from the inside out. In fact, I would have another full-length novel out by now, in my opinion, my magnum opus, had I not left my only manuscript in Lovelace's apartment. Kind of foolish to have one copy, wouldn't you say? Ellison butted in disparagingly. Enough of your interpolations, Ellison. You know I prefer to handwrite my novels, Stanley dismissed. Wait, so she didn't give it back? The waitress was enamored in the story, and in Stanley. She was seemingly wrapped in his intrinsic, unwitting charm. No, she threw me for a loop and kept telling me that she misplaced it, Stanley muttered, his voice dripping with cynicism. Then his face brightened up, his sunglasses catching the glint of the incandescent lights. However, on one of my visits I did get to throw her new boyfriend off a 2-story balcony, so tit for tat, I guess. What? How are you not in prison? She inquired, shocked. Stanley leaned back, lacing his fingers behind his head coolly. Well, there was a pool beneath. Oh, Well, I'm sorry about what happened, but it sounds like you got her back pretty good, she said flirtatiously, turning to go get that book. When she'd gotten out of earshot, Ellison turned to Stanley. I think she likes you. Why not ask her on a date? He said, only half serious. Ah, Brimsler, she's only infatuated with my achievement and status, nothing more. Besides, that ship has sailed, and sunk. Stanley muttered, still wishing he had a cup of coffee. Instead, while he waited, he got out his flask and took several gulps of the liquid vice within. Noticing Ellison's disapproval, he put the flask back into his inner jacket pocket. Keep the harangues to yourself. There's no changing my most lovable characteristic. I thought that was your narcissism, Ellison asked, deadpan. They both laughed. So anyways, what changed your mind about the interview? Really? I thought you were obstinate in pursuing the path of wallowing reclusive misery. He shifted in his seat and a contemplative look came over him. Cupping his chin in his hand, he hummed. When I used to go on vacations with my family, you know what the first thing that crossed my mind was? What? That perchance, by some twist of fate, I was going to meet a lovely young lady and chance at falling in love. He paused, ruminating as to how he was going to proceed. This singular thought would send a tingle through my body every time I would think about it. Before he could go on, Ellison intervened. Oh, wait a minute. So you're going to tell me that you, the cynical, life-hating bastard that you are, the guy who turned down so many chances at relationships after that debacle with Lovelace, and shut himself off from emotion and love completely, wants to go to this interview solely to find a new girlfriend. Stanley laughed derisively. Not necessarily, but gee, thank you very much for the description of myself. To this Ellison made a hat-tipping gesture and smiled. No, I was just starting in with an anecdote, actually. So what is your reasoning? I'm not really sure how to explain it. I suppose we can just chalk it up to spontaneity. And as I said before, I'm sauced at 9 o'clock in the morning. Besides, the more I think about it, I do consider it due time to expose Allison's rumors and deflate them. For posterity's sake, of course. I've found it, the waitress bubbled, taking short, quick steps toward their booth and holding a book in her hand. Stanley was relieved to see a cup of steaming coffee in her other hand. When she reached the table, she set the cup down in front of him as well as the book. He stared at it for a few moments blankly, prior to picking it up and briefly thumbing through the pages. Marvelous. It really is lovely to have such devoted fans, he said, taking a pen from his pocket and scrawling his carefully practiced signature across the front page. Afterward, she put it against her chest and squealed with delight. The girls will never believe this. Oh, thank you so much, Mr. Cromwell. Please, call me Stan, he said coolly, playing off her excitement and taking a sip of the coffee before him. Well, if there's anything else you need, let me know, she effervesced, going off to resume her tasks. Stanley put his hand on Ellison's shoulder, noticing his perturbed look. What's wrong? Are you all long-faced because she didn't recognize you as the famous writer you are? He instigated. Ellison hung his head and sighed. No, Stanley, I just cannot even hope to understand you. It has proved so many times to be a fruitless endeavor. To this Stanley took the flask back out of his pocket and dangled it in front of Ellison's face. It would probably help if you indulged in the elixir that forms my essential being, he said, taking another swig from it for emphasis. You know I could never touch the stuff. Alcoholism runs in my family, he uttered. Stanley shrugged his shoulders and stood up precariously, swaying as he stretched out. Your loss, my friend. When they had finished their coffee, they both got up to leave. Once Ellison had gotten out the door, Stanley stopped at the counter where the waitress was and paid for their coffees. Thank you for the wonderful service, my dear, he said politely, taking her hand and kissing it like the gentleman he was. This action thrust his mind into memories of the past, and his vision got hazy for a moment. The cold winter's night bitted his black shawl-collar cardigan as he walked hand in hand with her up the steps of the rickety wooden porch. The trailer attached wasn't anything special. but it had a certain charm and cleanliness to it. Inside, her dogs could be heard barking and intuitively scratching at the door for a peek at the stranger outside. With the goodbye near, he was worrying about what gesture to make. He knew that kissing her would be a little too progressive for a first date, and the thought of any contact at all sent a nervous tingle through him. So he did what any gentleman he idolized did. He brought her hand up to his mouth and gently kissed the top of it, looking deeply into her sparkling greenish eyes. A smile crossed her porcelain-white face, a smile that warmed him, heart and soul. "Good night, and farewell," he said against the wind, letting go of her warm hands and turning away. "Good night, Stan. I had a really good time with you tonight," she exclaimed, excitation and happiness saturating her words. He turned back again and smiled, waving a final time as the snow came down harder and swirled around her and the whole scene. The darkness came closing in around it all, like the curtain coming down at the end of a play. "Mr. Cromwell, are you all right?" the waitress's voice dully echoed into Stanley's ears. Yes, fine. Sorry, I was just overtaken by, a new idea. Happens all the time," he replied flatly, staring past her at the wall in a state of discomfiture. To clear his head a bit, he shook it and let go of the girl's hand. He glanced at her a final time, seeing that her cheeks were blushed, and then her face became blurry, his eyes losing focus, and he left. Outside, Ellison was waiting for him. "What were you doing in there?" he asked, walking beside Stanley. "Oh, nothing special, just making a fool of myself," he muttered, rooting his hands in the pockets of his overcoat, the memory still swimming around inside his imagination with vivid detail to it. He shut his eyes hard, the skin around them scrunching up. He rubbed them with his wavering hands, trying to shake the painful thought and get his eyes to quit burning. "So when is this interview?" he asked to get his mind going in a different direction. "The 15th of November, I believe," Ellison said. Stanley's eyebrows arched as he was rather surprised. "A month from now, then. I guess that gives us plenty of time to pack. You are coming as well, right?" "Yeah, I'm going to be a part of it too," he said with a proud tone to his voice. "Oh, that's lovely. It's a dual interview, then." "Well, let's face it, we are kind of a package deal at this point. One critic actually referred to us as the modern Harper Lee and Truman Capote in the aspect of our companionship." Stanley hummed thoughtfully and put his arm around Ellison. "Yeah, Primsler, I guess we are. Only one thing. You're definitely Capote." Ellison's brow furrowed questioningly. "Why?" "I think it's pretty obvious," Stanley said, looking off into another direction at a passing car to avoid Ellison's inquiring glare. There was a silence for a moment, and then Ellison said, "Because you're a woman?" To this they both smiled and broke into a friendly laughter, strolling up the street together like the old friends they were. Tune in next time, ladies and gentlemen, for Chapter 3. Thank you.